Okay. You can have your seat. We're gonna be we're gonna begin in about 1 minute. Okay, so if you would kind of take your seats and get together here. We don't want to keep the caterer. We don't want to have that food go bad. So we want to make sure. Okay. Yeah, she's over there. Oh yeah.
That lady, no,
Oh.
lady, Germany.
Oh, that won't be until
Did I read that right?
that'll be in July.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
she'll be
that
here
is.
in July, and she'll be preaching that day. Yeah. Well, good afternoon, all. Or no, actually, it's still morning. It's still morning. Uh, and we're glad that you've taken the time to. We're glad you've taken the time to be with us, to share what we're doing today. As all of you know, Pastor Chris is doing a lot of Bonhoeffer on her sabbatical. She'll be going to Germany and visiting that. So part of the sabbatical team wanted to share some information, a short video, giving a little bit of Bonhoeffer's life. But I want to share just a little bit that the video doesn't cover. Some of you who have been in our Bonhoeffer class where we looked at this book, Cost of Discipleship, probably will have heard some of this before. But just want to share with you that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for those of you that know, died by hanging in the Flossenburg concentration camp on the morning of April 9th, 1945. He was 39 years old. But it's been a very fruitful 39 years for this young man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I don't know how many of you knew this, but in some of my research, Bonhoeffer was a gifted pianist. He actually, in some of the information I found, composed some songs that were performed by the German Philharmonic when he was age 11. He lost his brother in World War II when he was killed in action when Bonhoeffer was 14. He decided after that time, after what he had gone through and what he was dealing with, decided to pursue his education in theology. And at the age of 21, he completed his Doctor of Theology degree at the University of Berlin. A few years later, in 1930, he moved to the United States. I don't know how many knew that he actually was living in the United States for a few years. He was at school, and I think he taught some at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. But while he was in New York, he had really a change that hit his life right between the eyes. He began to worship at what is known today as the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. He taught Sunday school there, and he listened to the pastor of that congregation, whose name was Adam Clayton Powell Sr. You may know Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was a congressman for a number of years from New York City. He was his father. He became impressed with his sermons and what he was saying because Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was a devotee of the gospel of social justice. During his time at Harlem, in that congregation, he became very sensitive to the social injustices experienced by racial and ethnic minorities in the United States. That affected him greatly. And I think it had a great effect on him in how he approached what was going on in his native Germany. A couple years later, he returned in 1931 and became a lecturer in theology at the University of Berlin. In 2 short years, in January of 1933, his career as both a teacher and a pastor was changed when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany and took over power and became basically a dictator. In the same year, Bonhoeffer decided, I'm going to raise a voice for church resistance to Hitler's persecution of the Jews, declaring that, and this is his quote, declaring that the church must not simply, quote, bandage the victims under the wheel, but jam a spoke in the wheel itself. It was during this time that Bonhoeffer actually left Germany for a couple years and was serving 2 German-speaking Protestant congregations in London, England. Now, some of his colleagues thought he was abandoning the people in Germany. And he must have heard that word because in a couple years, he headed back to Germany, where he became head of an underground seminary to train pastors to serve in what was established at the time an offshoot or a sect of the German church called the Confessing Church. It was a separatist movement against the German Christian church, which at that time had aligned itself almost exclusively with the policies and procedures of Adolf Hitler. It was during this time that Bonhoeffer wrote his most famous work that all of you may have copies of, Cost of Discipleship. For Bonhoeffer, in Cost of Discipleship, the issue of a discipleship life really involves following Christ and conforming to his teachings, even in the face of opposition and persecution. This book, this theological treatise, which I know some of you have read and some of you have tried to read, to try to get through, was really written to a church that he felt had lost its way and pastors who had lost their way. And he based the book, Cost of Discipleship, almost exclusively around Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew chapters 5 and 7. He thought that everybody must follow those rules. And he got on the church and he complained to the church and said, you are not following Jesus. Through his remaining years of his life, he dedicated to living out those principles that Jesus shared in that sermon. He believed that if the state and God are at odds, we must always lean towards God. Now, even though Bonhoeffer, when we look at his life, was a pacifist at heart, he believed that he was called to be a peacemaker and find ways to do that. He also realized that there are times when one must favor action over inaction. Bonhoeffer had to contend with that issue and really within himself trying to figure out what was the best course of action. Because he believed that inaction would undoubtedly cause more suffering and pain than action would. And so he could not sit by and remain silent, as he believed his silence and inaction would be allowing pain and suffering to occur unless he does actions to end the conflict. That led him to become part of a resistance group, and if I can pronounce it right, called the Abwehr. Along with others in this group, he became involved in operations to help German Jews escape to Switzerland. Now, due to this situation, and after people found out about it, Bonhoeffer was arrested in April of 1943. For the next year and a half, Bonhoeffer was in prison, in Tegel prison. It was during this time that Bonhoeffer wrote letters that were smuggled out of the prison by sympathetic guards. Those letters, after his death, were then assembled into a book titled Letters and Papers from Prison. So through these short 39 years, Bonhoeffer lived a life as a composer, a theologian, a pastor, a teacher, a writer, a resistance fighter, and in some cases, a secret agent. He lived a martyr's life and gave his life for a cause that he so ardently believed in. Bonhoeffer was a man really for his time, a man sent by God to make a difference. Now, in the video that we will show in just a few seconds, you will hear more about Bonhoeffer's life story. But what you will hear more about in the video is less about some of his time in America or London, but how he was involved with an assassination plot against Adolf Hitler. The video is titled The Preacher and the Swastika. Charles, go get him.
On the 20th of July, 1944, Adolf Hitler was meeting with his most trusted advisors in his top-secret, high-security bunker called the Wolf's Lair. This secret headquarters, deep in a Polish forest on the Eastern Front, had been built at the start of Operation Barbarossa, the tank invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. At 12:42 p.m., the site was rocked by a bomb that had been placed in a briefcase under the table. It was meant to kill Adolf Hitler, but it didn't. Someone had moved the briefcase behind a solid table leg, which shielded Hitler from the explosion. He escaped with just a perforated eardrum and singed and tattered trousers. The assassination attempt had been orchestrated by a group of high-ranking German military officers who wanted to take control of the government. They thought that Hitler was leading Germany to disaster. The conspirators codenamed their plan Operation Valkyrie. In retaliation for the attempt on his life, Adolf Hitler was to wreak a terrible revenge, arresting more than 7,000 people and executing almost 5,000 of them. Among those whom Hitler executed was a mild-mannered, bespectacled theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Above the west entrance of Westminster Abbey are 10 statues that were unveiled in July 1998. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is commemorated here as one of the 10 most important Christian martyrs of modern times. So, how did such an unassuming theologian get caught up in Operation Valkyrie? Well, join me as we follow Bonhoeffer's fascinating journey from its fairy tale beginning to a martyr's end. His story will challenge and inspire you. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in Breslau, Germany, a town which is today called Rochlau and is now in present-day Poland. The Bonhoeffers were an aristocratic and highly educated family in Berlin. His father, Dr. Karl Bonhoeffer, was an eminent neurologist and professor of psychiatry at the University of Berlin. His mother, Paula, was the daughter of Karl Alfred von Haas, one of the chaplains to Kaiser Wilhelm II, the last German emperor and king of Prussia. She was one of the few women of that time who had been given the opportunity to study at university. Paula was an accomplished educator and had a profound influence on her children. She taught them at home for many years, and all the children were encouraged to explore science, great literature, and the fine arts. Paula also encouraged her children to have a strong Christian faith. The family lived a privileged life on the outskirts of Berlin. As a teenager, Dietrich attended the Werder Gymnasium in Berlin. He was an outstanding student and also showed great musical talent on the piano, to such an extent that his family was even convinced that he was headed for a musical career. But even from an early age, Dietrich grew up fascinated with the big questions of life, such as, what is my purpose in life? Is there life after death? Is there a heaven? And what does eternity mean? His interest in the afterlife deepened during the Great War from 1914 to 1918, as reports of the deaths of soldiers, distant family members and friends filtered back to the home. Then, at the age of 13, shortly after his older brother Walter had been killed on the Western Front offensive of 1918, he shocked his family when he announced that he was going to be a theologian. His older brothers laughed at him. His father was shocked and not at all impressed with his decision. Dietrich Bonhoeffer chose to trade the prominence of an aristocratic upbringing in Berlin for the unpopular roles of theologian and pastor. And despite the strong family opposition, Bonhoeffer stood firm with his decision. And when he was 18, he began theological studies at the Friedrich Wilhelm University of Berlin. Bonhoeffer, coming from an upper-class family and a highly educated scholar, had lofty aspirations to convert the German church to his view that Christians must live out their faith in their community, that Christianity should be faith in action. And so he took a position as an assistant pastor to a German Lutheran congregation in Barcelona, Spain. He had no knowledge of pastoral work and so had little sympathy for the working class people, the destitute and the needy. But it was this experience with the poverty-stricken Spanish people of Barcelona in the lead up to the Spanish Civil War that opened his eyes. So it was here that Bonhoeffer's transformation from mere theologian to a compassionate pastor theologian began. In 1931, Dietrich returned to Germany, where he was ordained as a pastor, and he took up the position of lecturer at the University of Berlin and became interested in the international ecumenical movement to unite the Christian churches in Europe. He was still only 25 years old. At an ecumenical conference in Cambridge, England in 1931, Bonhoeffer called for a reduction in the size of armies and defense forces and for the nations of Europe to live peacefully together. But a World War I German corporal from Austria had a completely different vision for Germany and the world. His name was Adolf Hitler, and unfortunately, his vision was far more compelling to the German people than Bonhoeffer's. Adolf Hitler advocated the theory that Germans of Aryan blood were a master race, and as such, their proper role was as rulers in the world. Interestingly, the Japanese and Italians held the same opinion about themselves at this time. Now, the 1930s were a time of great upheaval in Germany. The German people were despondent after the defeat of World War I and the collapse of the monarchy. They suffered through the subsequent economic collapse and the mass unemployment of the Great Depression and the instability of the Weimar Republic or the German state after 1918. The charismatic Adolf Hitler appeared to be the nation's answer to their prayer. He said that God was behind the destiny of the German people and the fatherland. In 1933, Germany elected Hitler as Reich Chancellor, the legal head of the German government. By the end of 1934, he was essentially dictator of a new totalitarian state called the Third Reich. He was the Führer. Hitler offered the resurrection of the German people's honor, but He was not content to lead only the German state, but wanted to control the church as well. Now, the German churches were strongly influenced by nationalism and welcomed the rise of Nazism. Many of the German Christians began to promote the creation of a pro-Nazi Reich Church. They wanted all Christians to conform to Nazi ideology, and they pushed for the implementation of the state Aryan laws within the church. One Christian pastor of the state church wrote at the time,
Christ has come to us through Adolf Hitler.
it was clear that Germany had changed forever, and some like Bonhoeffer didn't like it. You see, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a tall young man with an athletic physique. With his mother's blue eyes and blonde hair, he perfectly fitted Hitler's Aryan stereotype. But any affinity between Bonhoeffer and the Third Reich stopped right there. Dietrich Bonhoeffer publicly opposed both Hitler's attempt to take over the German church and Nazi Aryan ideology. Bonhoeffer was now on a collision course with Adolf Hitler, and probably the only surprising thing is that Dietrich survived as long as he did. And just 2 days after Hitler's election as Chancellor in January 1933, while Germany was still celebrating its new leader, Bonhoeffer spoke on radio to a national audience, criticizing the new charismatic Chancellor and warning of the Nazi agenda that was sweeping Germany. Before he finished his talk, his broadcast was cut off, abruptly ended by government censure. Due to Hitler's direct influence, the leaders of the state church elected a new and fully Nazi-aligned leadership. Then a national church synod passed a resolution in September 1933 to remove all pastors and church officials of Jewish descent. In November, a rally of 20,000 Christians was organized demanding that the Old Testament be removed from the Bible because it was Jewish. Bonhoeffer opposed this move and was the first voice within the church to call for Christian resistance to Hitler's persecution of the Jews. Bonhoeffer opposed the persecution of the Jews and actively sought to protect them. This put him at odds with the unification of all Protestant churches into one single pro-Nazi Protestant Reich Church. Famous theologians like Karl Barth, Martin Niemöller, and the young Bonhoeffer and others publicly announced their resistance to the Nazis in the Barmen Declaration. When the rest of the church believed Adolf Hitler had been sent by God, this declaration insisted that Jesus Christ, not the Führer, was the head of the church. Despite this brave stand, Bonhoeffer felt disillusioned, and in late 1933 accepted a 2-year appointment to pastor a German-speaking Protestant church in London. Shortly after his return from London, Bonhoeffer was denounced by the Nazi government as a pacifist and as an enemy of the state. In 1936, he had his authorization to teach revoked, and his books were put on the banned list. Then, in January 1938, the Gestapo banned him from Berlin. Bonhoeffer became worried that he would soon be arrested because he would never swear an oath to Hitler or fight in his army. And to fail to do so, he would be seen as a traitor and sentenced to death. As it was becoming obvious that war would soon break out in Europe, Bonhoeffer's twin sister Sabine left Germany and escaped to the United Kingdom with her Jewish husband and 2 children. In June 1939, Bonhoeffer also left Germany and sailed to the safety of the United States with the intention of waiting out the war there. But as soon as Bonhoeffer stepped off the ship in New York City, he knew that he didn't belong there. His place was in Germany. He felt guilty that he had abandoned the fight for the soul of Germany. Bonhoeffer was absolutely convinced that life is a series of crucial decisions. He strongly believed that he should return to Germany and that one who believes does not flee. He wrote this:
I have made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period in our national history with the Christian people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people.
Bonhoeffer wondered what was to become of Christianity if it failed to oppose Adolf Hitler. For him, Christianity was faith in action. Hadn't he written that discipleship was costly? How could he play a role in encouraging and rebuilding the German Christian church if he had abandoned it in its darkest hour? So in July 1939, after just 26 days in America, Bonhoeffer returned to Germany on the last steamer ever scheduled to cross the Atlantic before the war began. But as soon as Bonhoeffer returned to Germany, he was denied the right to publish or to speak in public. Less than 2 months later, on the 1st of September 1939, Hitler ordered his panzer divisions into Poland, launching the Second World War. Bonhoeffer was now subject to the draft. To refuse military service was interpreted as being a traitor and usually meant execution. Fortunately for Dietrich, his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, had become an important member of the military intelligence department, or the Abwehr, the German secret service. Dohnanyi used his connections to find a job for Dietrich in that office, thus avoiding compulsory military service. Even though Dohnanyi worked for the Abwehr, he opposed the Nazi regime and had connections with the German resistance. Bonhoeffer's life changed when he began work with the Abwehr, the German secret service. Under the guise of traveling to ecumenical church conferences in Europe, he was supposedly working as a spy, collecting intelligence information about the places he visited for the German secret service. But he was also trying to make contact with the German resistance and the Allies, and was helping Jews escape Nazi oppression. The unassuming Bonhoeffer was now a double agent. But what the world didn't know at the time was that the German military intelligence were at the center of the German resistance to Adolf Hitler. They were actively engaged in long-term and highly complicated plots to kill the Führer and take over the government before another Nazi could do so. Until this time, Bonhoeffer had been a pacifist, but now he questioned his pacifist views. He still wore the mask of a devout pastor, but now, as a double agent, he became part of a secret plot to overthrow and later assassinate Hitler. He started to think that there might be a need for some form of more direct opposition to Hitler's regime. He had already made contact with some senior military officers who were secretly part of the small German resistance and opposed to Hitler. Through them, Bonhoeffer learnt about various assassination plots to kill Hitler. As part of the German Secret Service, Bonhoeffer also learnt of the Nazi atrocities against the Jews. He determined to work secretly to save as many Jews as possible. He also used his ecumenical contacts to sabotage Nazi war strategies and smuggle Jews to Switzerland. Bonhoeffer wrote,
Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act.
So when the first deportations of the Jews in Berlin occurred on the 15th of October 1941, Bonhoeffer and a friend wrote to his European contacts and trusted German military officials, telling them of the deportations, hoping it would help to stop the attacks. Bonhoeffer wrote,
We are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself.
Bonhoeffer also became involved in Operation 7, a plan to get Jews out of Germany by giving them papers as foreign agents. The Gestapo discovered details about Operation 7 and began looking for the dissidents and troublemakers who were opposing the Nazi state. In March of 1943, there were 2 unsuccessful assassination attempts on Hitler's life. This brought the fury of the Gestapo down on anyone involved in smuggling activities or the assassination plots. It was in April 1943, while Bonhoeffer was trying to help some German Jews escape to Switzerland, that he and his brother-in-law, Hans von Dornani, were arrested and taken to Tegel prison. Bonhoeffer was initially charged with conspiring to rescue Jews, using his foreign travels for non-intelligence matters, and misusing his intelligence position to help church pastors evade military service. For the next 2 years, Bonhoeffer and many other conspirators were imprisoned in Tegel prison while the Gestapo attempted to establish a case of treason against them and prove their guilt. Then, on the 20th of July 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, the chief conspirator, succeeded in exploding a bomb at Hitler's Wolf's Lair. Operation Valkyrie was unsuccessful. Hitler was furious and was determined to destroy anyone associated with the plot. This investigation led to the arrest of about 200 conspirators, including Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the highly respected and decorated German general who was allowed to take his own life. Bonhoeffer, though privy to various plots on Hitler's life, was never at the center of the plans. When some documents linked Bonhoeffer to the assassination plot and his connections to the broader resistance circles were uncovered, he was moved to the Gestapo prison in Berlin. On the 7th of February 1945, the day after he turned 39, Bonhoeffer was transferred from his prison cell in Berlin to Buchenwald and then to Regensburg. As he was transported from one prison to another, chained in the back of military trucks, Bonhoeffer shared his faith with the other prisoners. Whenever he had an opportunity, the softly spoken Bonhoeffer would encourage the other prisoners and share his belief in the gospel of Jesus Christ. By early April 1945, the Soviet army was on the outskirts of Berlin. Adolf Hitler personally ordered the SS chief Heinrich Himmler to have the remaining conspirators, including Bonhoeffer, executed. Bonhoeffer was accused of having been associated with the assassination plot, and on the 8th of April 1945, he was finally sent to the extermination camp at Flossenburg. Payne Best, a captured RAF pilot and fellow prisoner, wrote this observation of Bonhoeffer.
Bonhoeffer was different, just quite calm and normal. Seemingly perfectly at ease, his soul really shone in the dark desperation of our prison. He is one of the very few men I have ever met to whom God was real and ever close to him.
At the break of dawn on the 9th of April 1945, 1 month before Germany surrendered, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged. As they prepared him for his death, he preached a final sermon. His words were remembered and later retold by Payne Best. He remembers Bonhoeffer saying,
"This is for me the end, the beginning of life."
A decade later, a camp doctor who witnessed Bonhoeffer's hanging described the scene as follows.
The prisoners were taken from their cells and the verdict of court-martial read out to them. Through the half-open door in one room of the huts, I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer, before taking off his prison garb, kneeling on the floor praying fervently to his God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed, so devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a prayer and then climbed the steps to the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued in a few seconds. In the almost 50 years that I've worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God.
And so on the 9th of April 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged with 6 other conspirators. His brother Klaus Bonhoeffer was also executed for resistance activities, as were his brothers-in-law Hans von Donani and Rudiger Schleicher. Today, Bonhoeffer is remembered as a great modern martyr for Christianity. His principled resistance to Hitler's regime became a source of inspiration for other great modern leaders, such as Martin Luther King and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He's the ultimate witness to a world in turmoil. The story of Bonhoeffer's life challenges us. We can't just profess Christianity and not let it impact and transform our lives. During the 2 years in prison, Bonhoeffer wrote books that have since become devotional classics. One of his most famous is the book on the Sermon on the Mount, which is called The Cost of Discipleship. In this classic book, Bonhoeffer argued that true discipleship costs. He attacked the idea of cheap grace as an excuse for a lack of commitment to obedience and sacrifice. Instead, he preached costly grace. This is what he wrote.
Cheap grace is a grace we bestow on ourselves. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. Baptism without church discipline. Communion without confession. Cheap grace is a grace without discipleship. Grace without the cross. Grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate.
Bonhoeffer faced, and really why he chose to write Cost of Discipleship. That's the context that you see and that you hear. I want to end our time together here with a poem, kind of like a poem. It was written by Reverend Martin Niemöller. He was one of Bonhoeffer's colleagues who ended up in prison. He didn't die in prison. He was released, so he didn't suffer the same fate that Bonhoeffer did. But he was part of the confessing church, and this is what he wrote. First they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unions, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. I think that sums up a lot of where Bonhoeffer was and what he did with his life. Let's end with a prayer. Gracious God, as we gather today to learn the life of a martyr named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we do thank you for sending him into the world to make a difference in the lives of many. We ask that as we are sent into the world to practice discipleship and to share your word, that you are with us. Be with us today as we share a meal with one another and the food that has been prepared for us to strengthen us and be the people you've called us to be. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Thank you all for being. If you have any questions, you can see me at lunch. Lunch is served over in the CLC, so please go and enjoy.